Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is the program bringing you news, views, information, discussion, maybe even some wild ideas on religious liberty. I hope not, but we want to open your consciousness on this very important topic. My name is Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty Magazine, and my guest on the program is Dr. John Reeve from Andrews University, Department of Church History. And let's deal with some secular history, just to throw you. No, but I know it involves church history, because I believe much of what is going on today in the religious liberty era and church-state relations in the United States can be traced back, obviously, to what was once the mother country, to what went on in England and in Europe. And I'm very fixated on the Civil War in England that began with some largely secular reasons, but very quickly devolved to Protestants against what they saw as a Catholic sympathizing king, and even further devolved to Puritans and their agenda that was at odds with the Church of England and their desire to establish the kingdom of God on earth and a holy nation and a religious republic and the whole deal, and culminated with Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector, who really wanted to re-Christianize his country. What are your thoughts on that era, and maybe even further back? What can we say about that continuum and that history as how it then made its way to this part of the world?
When you go back to the magisterial Reformation, you really do not have any concept of having a separation of church and state. You know, the idea that whatever the king or the ruler, local ruler, has as their religion, the people should have that as their religion as well, was kind of the mode of the day. So, you know, as the king, so the people. And
it was the structure of society.
Of course.
You know, today we look at Asia and see that, like in China, that's very much the groupthink, and Japan. But that was Europe, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And it struck me with Christianity as it first began, wasn't it? Clovis was baptized, king of the Franks. Everyone was suddenly Christian. Yeah. And in Russia, 1,000 years ago now, it was the ruler of the Rus, and I'm trying to remember the ruler's name, but he was baptized. Everyone's suddenly Christian. They didn't even know what the religion was.
Yeah, yeah, and that's because the identity with their people, the identity, the leader is the people. And so when you end up with Henry VIII needing to turn away from Catholicism toward Protestantism in order to achieve his ends, he did not want to make any religious change. He just wanted to get rid of the power of the Pope and wanted to bring England back to the English power.
It was a bit bigger than his marriage.
It was bigger than his marriage.
And I will give him a little boost up. He had written some very interesting articles on the whole thing. Well, actually, now I remember a bit more. He also wrote against Martin Luther at one point.
Well, sure, yeah, he was called the defender of the faith.
Right, but he did write some prophetic treatises too. So he was very much involved theologically. He just wasn't.
He was a very astute theologian, but he was not interested in changing the way worship happened so much as he was interested in changing the power dynamics of the church, getting the land back from the church to usable land and taxable land, particularly. And his father before him, Henry VII, had been very poignant about trying to get a court of laws that were answerable to the king and not the local lords, so that there would be some justice in the land rather than just the Lord rules, and if the Lord was this.
Well, what you're really describing, which has been a long process also, was the move away from pure feudalism to more of a modern system of governance and a view of the individual rather than as a serf or a vassal.
But many people have said that the horse that Henry rode to power, Henry VIII I'm referring to, the horse that Henry rode to power was the Lollard horse, the followers of...
Well, now you're getting to, as I told you earlier, Wycliffe. I've got a very soft spot. Morning Star of the Reformation.
Yes.
And it was many, many decades before Martin Luther. So England had been stirred with a bit more biblically based views of religion rather than the autocratic church-state.
And it was
model.
Thomas Cromwell, who was the king's man in Parliament, that allowed him to make the break with Rome and to establish a Church of England with the king as the head of the Church of England, and then establish that the money would no longer flow to Rome but would stay local. All of this was changed by a person who was interested in a democratization of England and a king who was not interested in democratization. So you've got a tension between Thomas Cromwell and the king as to how to do it. And so the king uses Cromwell until he's not useful anymore. Then he puts him in prison, and then he cuts his head off, and that's the end of it. But he sets the stage for having a very strong, centralized government holding both the power of the state and the power of the church in one hand. That backfires on the English people a few years later when his oldest daughter comes to reign. Mary.
Bloody Mary
comes to the. Well, ironically though, they call
not the
her,
drink, the queen.
They call her Bloody Mary because she killed so many Protestants.
But it wasn't that many.
No, it wasn't.
300.
Less than 300 she killed, and her father killed some 70,000.
Yeah.
But
she was a fearsome presence in what was becoming Protestant England. She definitely, in many practical ways, rolled back the Reformation.
Well, she declared herself not to be the ruler of the king of the church in England, but declared the Pope to be the ruler of the church in England. And she tried to redo what had been done by Henry VIII in many ways, and the people didn't follow.
It was under her rule that Cranmer, Ridley and Cranmer, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Were burned at the
That's
stake.
correct.
And it's only about a year and a half ago I was in Oxford, and that little monument's still there, but very minimal. It's just as we were crossing the street, I sort of turned, and here's this little marker, says that on the spot they were burned.
Yeah, I was there last October.
Well,
it's still part of the history and the ambiance. Of what is modern England.
And then I think it was at Winchester Cathedral outside the was it Winchester? Yeah, one of the nearby cathedrals, or a cathedral nearby for us that same day. I noticed on the gate there was an acknowledgement that on that spot one of the churchmen of that cathedral had been burned, and also in Bloody Mary's era. So she went after the churchmen. She
did. She went after the church leaders that were keeping England away from papal authority. Now, when Elizabeth comes to the throne, she has to fight against the Catholic residual feeling in England in order to establish the Church of England. It takes her about 20 years. But then she immediately starts fighting with the Puritans, who are wanting to continue the reform, and she wants to hold her via Medea. So then you have this group that wants to take it further and have a more biblical ruler in the land, rather than someone who is interested in a middle way.
Well, I like and you're very correct, linking the Puritan antagonism further back. Because, in the Civil War, that's where it came to a head. But the Puritan movement was a long time in coming.
Yeah, it was the 1580s. You have John Pym, who's one of the pamphleteers that is trying to win the war for the hearts of the people against the Queen.
And what I see the Puritan movement as, it was the real outgrowth of the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah.
Church of England in England wasn't and still isn't. It was a continuation of the patterns of Romanism, but without the Pope.
Yeah.
In many ways.
It was Episcopal.
Yeah. And of course, as you know, in the Civil War, the precipitating element really was that preceded the parliamentary debates, and that was really the King's Archbishop, Lord, changing the Book of Common Prayer, which messing with the Bible almost with that. And they believed that the king and his archbishop were under the influence of the king's wife and Roman Catholic influence. So they saw a rolling back of the Reformation. That got everyone antsy. Yeah. And then when there was the political crisis, instantly it sort of devolved into, well, the king and his Catholic friends against the Puritans, who were the pure Protestants. Not always so, but that was their claim, just as today the religious right, claimed to speak for
but the Puritans
American uniqueness.
Were demanding religious freedom.
Yes.
But that's not their goal.
No.
Their goal was to impose Puritanism.
Yes. Well, it was their opportunity. They got it.
Yeah.
After the Civil War, that's essentially what they did.
Yeah.
Oliver Cromwell was essentially a Puritan and most friendly to some of the more extreme elements. And while I think for his time, the direct rule of the protector was relatively benign, he invited the Jews back. He was fairly indulgent to religious dissidents within Protestantism.
Yeah, he had more religious freedom than Charles I had.
Right. Not too good toward the Catholics, but yeah, I mean, his goal and his undoing was giving power to the major generals, I think they were called, in the different areas to administer religious practice, and they became odious to the population.
Sure.
So there was an attempt to enforce a certain type of religious behavior.
And a similar thing happened when the Puritans went to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in America.
Yeah.
The Puritanism there was not, the religious freedom they were claiming was freedom for them to do what they wanted to do,
As
rather
we've
than be
said
told.
other times, and I keep repeating it, what we're seeing now is the same type of thing. It's religious entitlement.
Yes.
Under the guise of religious liberty. And I don't think, well, they're self-deceived, but I don't think they say it cynically. But it's self-interest winning out on a principle. So you advance the principle, but you really only mean for our group, for the Puritans in that case, and perhaps for what they see as an American mainline Christianity here.
And of course, then you get Roger Williams, who starts as one of them and is then
well, he was on the inner circle.
Yeah, he was one of the elders.
But he had met with Oliver Cromwell. Yeah. He was the semi-adopted son of Lord Coke or Cook.
I didn't know that one.
Yeah, the Chief Justice who really laid the groundwork for the whole Puritan political movement. Like he was the guy that came up with the statement, "An Englishman's home is his castle."
Yeah,
he was one of the greatest jurists, but he was opposed to the king's power, at least in its unchallenged form, and he had a Puritan sensibility and directly prepared the way.
But when he comes to Massachusetts Bay, then he ends up with being at odds with those who would say he cannot worship the way he wanted to.
Well, and you know, I'm not a self-proclaimed expert on it, but I'm very interested in this, and I believe that he was exemplifying the core principles that the real thinkers in that movement have been advancing, not the popularist application of unrestricted Puritan sensibility. And part of the proof of that is, remember, out of that era came John Milton's Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and some of his other writings. And I can argue that even Adventism, our great controversy theme, comes straight out of John Milton.
Well, at least
and it's a wonderful concept of the freedom of man to rebel, and God giving back His power and freedom to morally regain everything He'd lost. So I think at root the Puritan movement had good thoughts, but just like all movements, if it's not restricted, its excesses undid its gains.
And its excesses, would you see it's fair to say that their excesses came to bear when they recognized that if they could be in power, they could call all the shots for their own?
Absolutely. And the one thing that is a stain against that era was Oliver Cromwell's Irish expedition, where he put the island to the sword.
Sure.
We'll be back after a short break to continue this review of Puritan history and English history, and perhaps some applications for the United States and the world today. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Liberty Insider. Before the break, we were really waxing, or one of us, maybe I guess you were waxing eloquent on church history and the Puritans and their excesses, as there were many. And I was reminding you and the viewers of the great heritage that we get by way of John Milton, who was secretary for foreign languages to Oliver Cromwell, very close associate. And he wrote Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, as well as some other great works of literature. But let's talk about the application to today. What echoes do we see of that era and of that mentality today in the United States and maybe in the English-speaking world?
Well, the reality is when Puritanism began, it was fighting for religious freedom. But what it meant was it wanted freedom for itself to exist. Yeah. And when it did come into power, it restricted religious freedom because it had achieved its goal. Yeah. Then I brought up Roger Williams as having been kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony because of his religious dissidence and his desire to have a religious freedom.
It didn't happen instantly, though.
No,
They even offered him the to be the pastor of the main church there, if you remember.
Yes, I don't know if it would have gone well, but...
No, and I think he knew that. But he wasn't, my point is, he wasn't disliked on at first blush.
No.
They wanted to incorporate him, but they soon found out his views were a little different.
And his views got him into trouble with them, and then when he left, he kind of becomes the one of the main voices in America early on for religious freedom. And the Pennsylvania experience and the whole thing that happens there is another voice for religious freedom. Yeah. But the current forebears, or I mean not forebears, the current descendants of Roger Williams are largely the Baptists now. And the Baptists who have been strong on religious freedom, the Institute of Religious Freedom down at, what's the institute called in Waco?
Baylor Institute.
Baylor Institute.
J.M. Dawson Institute in Baylor.
There we go.
But it's been closed up. It doesn't exist
Correct,
anymore.
correct.
And that corresponded with what you're referring to, sort of a rethinking of how they would present religious freedom.
Because they had been presenting largely
separationism.
Religious freedom by separation from church and state, and now the majority of the Baptists seem to be calling for a Christian state in order to have religious freedom for Christians.
And as we all know with the Southern Baptists, they're not always that unified.
No.
and in Washington, there's the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Freedom, and we work very closely with them, and their view is exactly as you stated the historical position. The religious liberty for all under the model of separation of church and state.
But more and more, there's a populist call
it's a move away
for a Christian nation that is saying, and you've been terming it as religious entitlement rather than religious freedom.
Yeah.
And it's the idea of religious freedom for me and my kind, but no religious freedom for anyone else.
Well, they've never gone that far to say that, but that's implicit in that model. It's true. And in many ways, the cat's out of the bag because this coalition and their actions through the administration in dealing with blocking people from Islamic countries and so on, that shows that there's they haven't said particularly bad things beyond we want to exclude them, but what they should have said instead was, this is not right to sort of marginalize whole religious groups under the excuse of terrorism or whatever.
Right.
But they've lost that opportunity. So they're not sensitive to the liberties of non-Christian, non-Baptist, and so on.
In previous programs, you've emphasized that the rights of the minority are at the core of the understanding of religious freedom. Why don't you articulate that a little more in the current circumstance?
Well, the best I can do is I'll tell you an example that I told you in the break. Recently, I got into a discussion with a black Muslim chaplain at a certain meeting. And he was a wonderful person. I really was impressed by him as an individual. I was a little troubled, to hear a reiteration of the theology of Nation of Islam. And he himself particularly referred to Elijah Muhammad and Farrakhan and so on. And Louis Farrakhan's got a lot to answer for. He appeared with Gaddafi and when Gaddafi was attacking the US, and he was in Iran recently when they were chanting "Death to America" and so on. I wouldn't want to be associated with that. But I told this fellow, I said, it shouldn't be necessary to argue out our differences so much that I'm 100% satisfied with your theology and you with mine before I can defend your right. I said, true religious liberty means that I grant you the right to be wrong, grossly wrong, to believe something that I find doctrinally offensive, but I will defend your right to believe that and to practice that to the death.
Yeah.
That's got to be religious liberty, because you would want the reverse. We would talk about Adventists in their early days, marginalized, even persecuted. The other thought that they were a crazy little group. Yeah. I don't think that's the case today. We've become very respectable, which is not always a blessing. But it's where it's in the extreme, just like freedom of speech. It's fine to have a principle, but if that just means you allow people to say things that you're comfortable with, that agree with you, there's no freedom of speech. No. It's precisely when you defend the right of something that you find purely objectionable, incendiary or whatever, then you have freedom of speech. And for the US to have continued religious liberty, it must defend what apparently is the indefensible. Yeah. And I'll say the obvious. It's absolutely obvious that an element of Islamic thinking leads directly to terrorism and terrorist activities. Doesn't mean by any means that all Muslims are so inclined. Hardly. But even if you could connect that, as I just did with Islam, why would you restrict the practice of a faith? Right. And in fact, I'll go even further. And this is, I haven't read this anywhere else, but I have to hold this as a principle. If there were a religion that was premised on sacrificing babies and all the rest, I would allow it. Defend their right to believe whatever. If they sacrificed a child, they go to jail. Right. You can't allow things that are against normal civil interaction. As I say that, you've got to be careful about, as Scalia said, laws of general applicability that might snare a certain religious practice. Obviously, that's sort of, Daniel got caught into that where the councillors gave the king an idea for a law that was designed to snare Daniel. Correct. But, different times, different religious groups have done things that may have harmed either themselves or other people in the name of their religion. You can't allow that because it's a general civil interest. But you still cannot restrict the right of someone to believe a religion that it's deeply held. And the US legal system is recognizing that when you ask for religious accommodation, it's not because your church advances that, it's because you're conscience bound. Yeah. And Jefferson and the others greatly respected conscience. We have to honor a deeply held conscience position of an individual. But that doesn't mean that in the name of religion you can declare jihad or crusades, not allowed, or as the president ran up against to his detriment, the neo-Nazis and all the rest. It's fine to say neo-Nazi. No one likes Hitler. People forget that the neo-Nazism and some of these groups also refer to Christian theology. They've got a theological base, corrupt as it might be. Yeah. So I give the right to people to believe things, but they can't do anything in the name of it.
So in the end, you have to have a minority protection in religious liberty. You have to have the idea that those you disagree with need to have religious freedom in order for you to have true religious freedom.
There is a point in Tennyson's poem Ulysses where he has the aged hero return from the Trojan Wars, wishing that he could take another adventure. And he says to his old sailor friends, he says, it's not too late to seek a newer world. Let's push off and go wherever the winds may take us. For the Western world, in many ways, they had that sensibility. The old world, especially under the Dark Ages, had been a pretty fearsome, desolate place. But now with the age of exploration, off we go to the new world. Oh, that it had been so simple that this newer world was to be the paradise they hoped, but it wasn't. Unfortunately, many of the same sins were visited on the new world. And when we study religious liberty and its yearnings and development under the Reformation, as it came to the new world, many of the same problems were brought across. And we need to recognize the continuum of man's search for freedom and also the continuing futility, because those same breakers that so frustrated Ulysses in his efforts to get home are still breaking on the efforts of man to make their own homeland without God. We need to have God and his eternal principles of freedom for a true successful voyage. For Liberty Insider, this is Lincoln Steed.